Welcome back to the channel. Anthony Fauci testified yesterday in front of Congress, and it was a riveting hearing. Largely, he denied the more serious accusations that he tried to impede or cover up any discussion of the possibility of lab leak. He denied the gain-of-function research that was going on in the Wuhan Institute, and he didn't admit getting anything wrong at the time. He basically said that they did the best they could with the information that they had, and any decisions that, to us, in retrospect, seemed completely foolhardy, like the 6 feet social distancing, he distanced himself from. He gives himself 6 feet of distance. He didn't do it. The CDC did it. Well, he's had a lot of defenders in the media and on social media. The New York Times has an article that largely vindicates him on the lab leak, that he didn't do anything wrong there. And Ashish Jha on Twitter has praised him, saying that some of these more egregious errors, like 6 feet distancing, were made by the CDC, not Anthony Fauci, and he did his best to urge them to correct that issue. Well, let's get into it. Let's get into these topics. Let's see what the real assessment, I think, of his performance is. First, I got to say, no one gets more favorable media coverage than Anthony Fauci. I mean, it's truly the most favorable and uncritical media coverage. And I do give him credit for that. Somehow he has built connections with reporters and institutions such that they revere him and they do not want to criticize him. It's even more favorable, in my opinion, than Democratic politicians. They even have their policies called out more than Anthony Fauci has. He has pretty much the unyielding support of the legacy media. In contrast, you can listen to the All In podcast and David Sachs' reflections on Anthony Fauci, which I think are much closer to the truth, much closer to reality, and so different from the legacy media. And I think that's why these kinds of things are thriving, like the All In podcast. Ashish Jha, of course, he became the COVID czar because of his tweets in favor of the Biden administration. He was basically auditioning for them online, and it's no surprise that he tries to defend Anthony Fauci further. So let's talk about these issues. Number one, Wuhan, lab leak, EcoHealth Alliance, funding gain-of-function research, the FOIA emails. Anthony Fauci has a deputy named David Morans who, in prior congressional testimony and a number of emails that were requested through FOIA requests, basically admits that they worked with the Freedom of Information Act officials to prevent these emails from being discovered by Republican congresspeople who are investigating this issue. That's actually a big problem, and I think technically illegal, because the purpose of Freedom of Information Act requests for federal agencies, the purpose of congressional oversight of places like NIH, is that the NIH is accountable to the public for the decisions they're making. They're not allowed to use Gmail servers, as Mr. Morans indicated that they were doing. They are required to save and record these emails about NIH business. In one instance, they misspell the name of Christian Anderson, his last name, using a $sign in a way to try to evade the search filters that get used for FOIA requests. Somebody later is going to search through emails and type Anderson. They're going to miss that because it has a misspelling in it. And then he talked about how he has worked with the FOIA official to try to minimize these emails from being turned over. That's a big problem. I mean, if anyone else were doing that, if that were being done by someone in the Trump administration, the media would be outraged about that. And yet here it's largely indifferent and silent to that. I find that so telling. Anthony Fauci says that this guy didn't directly report to him. He's trying to distance himself in the congressional hearings. That's so disingenuous. It was clear. This guy talks about meeting Anthony Fauci on his doorstep and telling him things in person so that they won't be able to be discovered by Congress. That's a problem, and we have to acknowledge. Whether or not you believe the virus leaked from a lab or didn't, their conduct around it was egregious and unjustified. Not only did they go around saying that they were 100% sure it didn't come from the laboratory, they actively suppressed any dialogue or dissent on that topic. They worked with media companies to cast that narrative of lab leak as a racist narrative. That's what Apoorva Mandavilli said on the New York Times, on our Twitter account. They worked with Facebook to make sure that no one could even discuss that topic, that those posts would be removed. The brute power of censorship preventing people from having a dialogue on perhaps the single most important viral origin story of the last 100 years. That was an egregious abuse of power. He, at no point in time, conveyed to the public his uncertainty about that. He repeatedly pushed the idea that lab leak was a conspiracy theory akin to 5G causing COVID itself. In private, his emails reflected a completely different view. Lots of uncertainty, lots of discussion, lots of doubt. Perhaps they even knew a little bit more. We don't know. they were using potentially other email servers where they don't have all the emails from, including Gmail. That disconnect alone, I think, is quite damning. Imagine any other government portraying that we knew with certainty weapons of mass destruction exist, but their private email communications were to reveal that they were very, very uncertain about that. That alone has been established clearly that they had this gap, and that alone is quite damning, that they would allow the media narrative to be so misguided, perhaps even shaping that misguided media narrative. These emails from David Moran's are extremely damning. They're trying to subvert any oversight, prevent people from seeing them conduct government business. That's absolutely unacceptable. And I think that if the media were actually fair, or if Fauci were in the Republican camp and a known Republican supporter, they would have obliterated him for that issue alone. So it is really, I do think, incredibly imbalanced. Let's talk about some of the other things he said. He said in the congressional testimony, he was asked about the United States masked children under the age of 5, something that I've written a lot about, how crazy that was, how that defied European CDC guidelines. And they asked him, Mr. Fauci, what evidence supported that? He admits there was no evidence that I'm aware of that supports that. And yet he pushed that policy. I mean, if you're the face of the public response and you're not actively criticizing a policy, if you're tacitly approving a policy, you are endorsing that policy. And he did that. He says now in the congressional hearing yesterday that we didn't have time to study that. We just had to act. That is also a false dichotomy. He could have done it and studied it. He just chose never to study it. I think people forget. He is the director of NIAID. The budget is $5 billion. He decides what randomized studies are run. Ashish Jha says on Twitter, Anthony Fauci tried to get CDC to change the 6 feet recommendation. Actually, no one has actually done a study of 3 feet versus 6 feet versus 1 feet in the peak of coronavirus. We actually don't have great data. You can say for sure that 6 feet was pulled out of someone's ass, but what you can't say for sure is that 6 feet is wrong and 3 feet is right or 1 feet is right. They're all pulled out of someone's ass. And the way you separate the truth from reality, from fiction, is to run a randomized study. Only one person has the complete authority to run these studies, and that's Anthony Fauci. He controls that research budget. So repeatedly, he says, it's not my fault we didn't generate it. It is exactly his fault. A good scientist would generate data when you have uncertainty. The only reason, I suspect, he doesn't generate data is because that data could contradict what he's been saying. And at some point, he views himself less as a scientist and more as an infallible spokesperson, the kind of spokesperson who they'll make bobblehead dolls of, rather than a scientist who's willing to hear other ideas and to run studies to sort this out. He's 100% wrong that you couldn't run a study. You could have run a study. Number 2, he's 100% wrong that you'd have to wait for the study. You didn't have to wait. You could have done it and gotten the study. You could have gotten the study in the summer of 2020 and then stopped it when the study was negative, as it obviously would be, because only an idiot would think that masking a 2-year-old with a cloth mask works, and we actually have randomized data that cloth masking doesn't work. So pretty much all of the recommendations for masking in 2020, which were cloth masks, didn't work, particularly young children, who did, I think, suffer disproportionate harms of the pandemic. And for him not to admit, that's not just wrong now, it's wrong at the time. The Europeans did not do that. Europeans sent their kids back to school by the summer of 2020. Largely, school closures were much shorter. These are decisions that were wrong at the time, and he refused to hear other points of view on that. He only listened to himself. Let's talk about 6 feet. 6 feet, yeah. Where did it come from? Nobody knows where it came from, but yet they extolled it. I showed a video earlier that Francis Collins was singing about it in his little song and dance about Poof Coronavirus, a pathetic parody song. He was singing about it and endorsing 6 feet of distancing. This is the NIH director. Why wouldn't you run the study? You could have run the study. I don't understand why. What's the excuse here? Ashish Jha, all these people making excuses. There's not many people who control a research budget of $5 billion. You give me a $5 billion research budget tomorrow, we're going to start running some real studies within a month, okay? If it's a pandemic, within a day. But if it's, time of peace, within a month. School closure. Anthony Fauci was on TV repeatedly in the spring of 2020, critical of Ron DeSantis' decision to reopen schools. Fauci was 100% wrong. He didn't have to go on. That's the other thing. He didn't have to be on TV. He makes it seem like he was a public official doing his best, now getting unfair criticism. And I do agree that, once people start to physically threaten the man, that, it is unfair, and he doesn't deserve that. He does deserve, I think, a proper hearing for his conduct. But The other point to make is that he chose to go on all these TV programs and become the face of the pandemic response. He chose that. I don't think he chose that because he had the best information at hand. I don't think he chose that because he even believes he's the best at thinking about pandemic response. I think he chose that to a large degree because he's a narcissist. When you look in his office, you see every photo of himself up on the wall. There's another person I know who does that. I mean, that's a sign of narcissism, okay? He likes to hear his own voice. And that means he put himself out there so many times making strong claims, and he couldn't back it up. And he didn't want to study it. Spent more time on TV. He could use that TV time to be coordinating cluster randomized studies to answer these issues. Great Barrington Declaration. The Great Barrington Declaration authors were scientists who had a different point of view on what we should do to young people, young workers, schools, colleges. They refused to discuss those ideas with them. They ostracized them. They demonized them. They called them fringe epidemiologists. That is inexcusable. They know that these people are good faith epidemiologists who disagree on the issue, but they did not want it to contradict the narrative. Finally, vaccine mandates. He won't admit that that was an error. It was an error at the time. They had evidence at the time the mandate was implemented that it did not halt transmission, ergo there's no benefit to third parties. They claim that there's a personal health benefit, but they don't know how many people who were mandated. Okay, so let me explain something. If you look at vaccine uptake over time before mandates, it was going steadily up, and it was kind of, the rate of growth was slowing, but it was still going up and up and up. Then you drop a mandate, and what happens from the mandate is two things. One, a bunch of people exit the labor force. They lose their job or quit because they don't want that mandate. And some people get the shot who otherwise wouldn't get the shot because of the mandate and only the mandate. And so what you'd expect to see is that the curve is going up, but then the mandate drops. Right before the mandate drop, it has a sharp uptick to show like the extra people who got it just because of the mandate. But when you look at all these curves, you see a very negligible change there, suggesting that a lot of people would have, negligible change there, suggesting that some people were going to get it anyway. To be honest, they just need a little more time, which is certainly true. And some people were going to exit the labor force with that threat. The problem with the mandate isn't just that I don't think it changed that delta that much, and I've tried to estimate it mathematically, and I think it's something between 1 and 4%, a very tiny fraction of Americans. And some people may disagree with me, but I think if you actually do the math on that, it's going to be a very tiny fraction of people. That's because a lot of people exited labor force. That's because a lot of people had already done it, perhaps because of other misguided rhetoric. How many of those people had already had and recovered from COVID-19? I'm not certain that they get any health benefit. They probably got net harm. How many of those people were people you didn't really have to go after? 18-year-olds, 22-year-olds, 22-year-old healthy college kids. You didn't really have to go after that population. I suspect, we don't have great data, that the mandate disproportionately fell on the age groups that had the least to gain from the vaccination and didn't fall on the older age groups who were happy to say, I'm retired anyway, you have no power over me, or I'm happy to, I'm happy to lose my job at 64, retire early or something like that. There will be a study out soon about how many people lost their job from the mandates. So I think the mandates were a total fiasco. I told him at the time, I'd written many op-eds about that at the time. He went ahead and implemented that, and he still won't admit that that's wrong. And the lay media, of course, which rallied behind that, won't admit it's wrong. So closing thoughts. I think, I say this as somebody who once really admired the person and who is really coming at this, trying to be as impartial as I can about his conduct as a scientist. I think, D-F performance. I think there's no way to judge him other than D- or F. He is a smooth talker. He likes to go on TV. In some ways, he's a comforting voice. He got pretty much every single key pandemic issue wrong. Lockdown, wrong. Social distancing, wrong. Masking with young kids, wrong. Worse, when he did say in retrospect, I always knew they didn't have data. Well, why didn't you generate the goddamn data? You control the research budget. Why didn't you generate the data to leverage them to make the right choices? What is the excuse for that? Going against DeSantis in schools, his opposition to Trump, I think he very cleverly positioned himself as somebody who, look, I never said I'm a Democrat, but if you look at who he criticizes, you would conclude that that's the case. And by aligning himself with one political party, he has really greatly insulated himself against any sort of fair hearing or follow-up on his conduct. And so in some ways, he is a master politician. He's a master politician that you could run a pandemic response, get so many things wrong, not try to reduce uncertainty, fail to be a scientist, ostracize people, censor voices, and then still have the lay media groveling at your feet. You got to give him credit. He's a master politician. Will there ever be a real, accurate, honest appraisal of his conduct? I'm not sure anymore. It will only come when people in the center, on both sides, start to acknowledge that there were some great errors made. Maybe it'll come if the Gmail is revealed. Maybe it'll come if some text messages are revealed, if we get more data about what was being said that they don't want us to know was being said. The next thing is, you're not supposed to circumvent FOIA in this way, okay? I know it feels like, oh, they're out to get me. You're running a NIAID, like you're running a federal agency. You need to know that people will be looking over everything you do, and you need to do it in a transparent way. You're supposed to be open and honest about your uncertainties on these issues. And had you been at the time, we might have made different policy decisions. That's the other thing. Had they said, we really don't know about whether or not this leaked from a lab, Facebook would never have censored it. People would have a different discussion. Hey, had they said, we really don't know, had he gone on TV once and said, I actually don't know where 6 feet came from, I'm sure that's right, people would have been motivated to study that topic. People would have not been so rigid about that with schools. So him keeping secret his uncertainties is just so bad and unacceptable as a scientist. Whenever I read a paper review on this channel, I'm happy to say what's bad, what's good, and what I'm still uncertain about. You can go back, lutetium 177 PSMA. Just as an example, I say this trial is bad. Vision doesn't prove that it works. At the same time, I think it might work, right? So we have to express our uncertainty. It's up for policymakers to decide how to interpret that. So, he gets an F rating. He has really done a lot of damage. And Congress has no desire to give a fair hearing, and the media is, I think, incredibly biased on this topic. That's unfortunate. Well, those are my thoughts on the Fauci hearing. And again, I say this as someone who, once had a lot of admiration for him, but not for how he handled these so critical decisions when he was uniquely positioned to bring evidence to uncertainty. And he didn't do that, and he took dogmatic positions. He didn't criticize anyone other than Republicans so that you would know he's a Democrat, so that the media later would not criticize him very cleverly. And I think was much more of a politician than a scientist, in my opinion. So if you like this video, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, comment, leave a message below. Until next time.